In 1991, one of the most powerful empires of the modern world vanished almost overnight. The Soviet Union, once a global superpower that shaped international politics, inspired revolutions, and dominated half of Europe, collapsed with a speed that stunned even the people living inside it. This story is not simply about a sequence of events or a dramatic ending. It is about the deep forces that pushed an entire system to its breaking point. Economic stagnation, political rigidity, rising national tensions, and reforms that unintentionally accelerated its downfall. In this video, we explore why the Soviet Union truly fell, not just the headlines or the final moments, but the roots beneath the surface, how decades of pressure built up inside the country, how leaders struggled to keep control, and how ordinary people began demanding change. We dive into the hidden mechanisms of decline, the decisions that reshaped history, and the slow erosion of a superpower that once seemed unshakable. Understanding this collapse is more than a history lesson. It offers insights into how powerful systems fail, how societies evolve, and how leadership, economics, and public sentiment can interact in ways that transform the world. Whether you are a history enthusiast or someone curious about how nations rise and fall, this journey will give you a clearer, deeper look at the forces that ended the Soviet era. If you find this content valuable, make sure to like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us bring more well-researched, engaging stories like this to life. Let us begin our exploration into the fall of a superpower and the lessons it continues to teach us today. As we move deeper into the story of the Soviet Union's decline, the roots of its collapse become clearer when we examine the slow, grinding economic stagnation that settled over the country during the 1970s and continued into the 1980s. This was not an external shock or a sudden downturn, but a long, quiet erosion of vitality, a gradual weakening that touched every part of society. For years, the Soviet model had been built on rapid industrial expansion, heavy state planning, and the belief that central control could guarantee progress. In its early decades, this system produced impressive achievements, fueling a sense of national pride and proving that the nation could rebuild from immense devastation. Yet by the time the 1970s arrived, the momentum that once powered the Soviet engine had begun to fade, revealing deep structural issues that could no longer be ignored. Factories that had once symbolized strength were running on outdated machinery, consuming enormous resources but producing little innovation. Agriculture remained fragile despite countless reforms, often failing to meet the needs of a growing population. Everyday goods from clothing to appliances were chronically short in supply, creating long queues and a sense of constant waiting. Beneath the surface, the planned economy struggled with inefficiencies that planners could not solve. No matter how many targets they set or quotas they raised, the system rewarded output over quality, obedience over creativity, and preservation over improvement, slowly turning economic life into a cycle of repetition rather than growth. At the same time, the global landscape was shifting. Other countries were embracing new technologies, modern management, and more flexible economic models. The world was becoming interconnected through trade, finance, and information. Yet the Soviet Union remained insulated by design, protecting its economy from foreign influence at the cost of falling behind. While its rivals invested in computers, electronics, and new manufacturing techniques, the Soviet system struggled to adapt, burdened by bureaucratic layers that slowed every decision. Leaders understood that modernization was necessary but found themselves trapped between the need for change and the fear that reform might undermine the political authority holding the country together. The burden became heavier as the nation committed vast resources to its competition with the United States. The arms race demanded constant investment in military development, space achievements, and global influence. While these projects demonstrated power, they also drained funds from consumer industries, housing, transportation, and essential services. Ordinary people felt the impact. Workers earned wages that often could not buy what they needed. Families waited years for apartments, and entire regions lacked reliable infrastructure. The contrast between superpower image and daily life grew more visible with each passing year. For many citizens, this stagnation created a quiet frustration. It was not a sudden outcry but a slow shift in mood, a sense that promises of prosperity were no longer matched by reality. Younger generations, especially those who had known only peacetime, questioned why their lives felt restricted, why opportunities seemed limited, and why the system resisted new ideas. Scholars, economists, and even some officials began discussing the need for significant changes, though such conversations often happened in guarded tones. By the early 1980s, the situation had become impossible to overlook. The economy was not collapsing in a dramatic way, but was simply failing to grow, like a vast machine that continued to run yet produced less with every turn. This prolonged stagnation became one of the most important forces weakening the Soviet Union from within, shaping public confidence, limiting the government's ability to respond to crises, and setting the stage for the reforms that would soon arrive, reforms that promised renewal, but ultimately opened the door to even greater transformation. As the Soviet economy continued to lose momentum, another immense pressure intensified its internal strain: the long and costly competition with the United States. This rivalry, which had defined global politics since the end of the Second World War, was more than a contest of ideology or military power. It became a constant demand on the Soviet system, compelling leaders to direct vast portions of national resources toward maintaining parity with a country whose economy was far more flexible and technologically advanced. While officials spoke confidently about strength and global responsibility, the reality beneath the surface was far more complicated. The arms race acted like a weight tied to the Soviet economy, pulling it further downward at a time when it desperately needed room to breathe and adapt. Throughout the 1970s and 1980s, both superpowers invested heavily in nuclear arsenals, advanced missiles, submarines, strategic bombers, and emerging technologies that promised to redefine future conflicts. For the United States, these expenses, though enormous, were supported by a dynamic economic environment capable of absorbing them. For the Soviet Union, each step forward in military capability required difficult decisions that diverted funds away from everyday needs. The nation produced tanks and rockets at remarkable speed, yet struggled to provide modern housing, reliable transportation, or consumer goods for its citizens. Factories that could have been retooled to produce advanced electronics or household items instead focused on meeting military quotas. Scientists who might have driven technological innovation worked within defense projects that advanced strategic goals but did little to improve civilian life. This imbalance grew more visible as American advancements accelerated. New radar systems, computer-guided weapons, and high-tech equipment highlighted the growing gap between the two countries. To keep up, the Soviet government expanded its defense budgets, pushing an already strained economy even further. Large segments of industrial capacity were absorbed by military demands, creating a situation in which the nation appeared powerful abroad while facing growing shortages and delays at home. The contradiction between strength on the world stage and limitations in everyday life deepened public dissatisfaction and made the leadership increasingly aware that maintaining the rivalry came at a cost the system could barely afford. The arrival of new American initiatives in the early 1980s intensified this pressure even more. Strategic programs designed to challenge Soviet capabilities forced the government to choose between slowing the pace of the arms race or committing even greater resources to match the perceived threat. In a closed political environment where any sign of weakness risked undermining national credibility, the choice was almost predetermined: funds that could have supported agricultural improvements. Technological modernization or infrastructure repair were instead directed towards sustaining military competition. The result was a widening gap between public expectations and government priorities, further eroding the sense of stability that leaders worked hard to maintain. For ordinary citizens, these decisions translated into long lines, limited supplies, and a daily struggle that contrasted sharply with official claims of progress. Although many understood the importance of national security, they also saw how the pursuit of military parity affected their quality of life. Conversations behind closed doors reflected the growing belief that the system was stretched beyond its limits. Even among officials, the awareness that the economy could not continue supporting such overwhelming demands became increasingly difficult to ignore. By the time the 1980s reached their midpoint, the arms race had become more than a strategic contest. It had evolved into a test of endurance that the Soviet Union was losing not through a single dramatic failure, but through the slow erosion of economic strength. The burden of keeping pace with the United States compounded the stagnation already gripping the country, weakening the foundation of an empire that once aspired to reshape the future. This combination of internal strain and external pressure pushed the Soviet system closer to a point where change was no longer optional but inevitable, setting the stage for the profound transformations that would follow. As the weight of stagnation and the relentless demands of military competition pressed harder on the Soviet system, another force worked quietly but powerfully to limit the nation's ability to respond. The rigid political structure that had guided the country for decades. The Communist Party, once celebrated as the architect of rapid industrialization and wartime resilience, had become an institution resistant to change, shaped by habits and hierarchies that no longer reflected the needs of a transforming world. Its leadership framework, built on strict centralization and careful control of information, made it difficult to acknowledge problems openly, let alone confront them with bold new solutions. In an era when adaptability was becoming essential, the system remained anchored in practices developed during a very different time. This rigidity created an environment where innovation struggled to take root. Officials advanced not because they introduced fresh ideas, but because they maintained stability, avoided conflict, and followed established procedures. Meetings and reports tended to reinforce what leaders wanted to hear, muting the voices of those who recognized the severity of the economic challenges. Even when evidence showed that factories were falling behind, that agricultural reforms were failing, or that public dissatisfaction was growing, many within the leadership hesitated to push for significant changes. The fear of destabilizing long-standing structures overshadowed the need for renewal. In a system where authority flowed downward and accountability flowed upward, questioning the foundation of policy felt risky. And over time, this cautious culture became ingrained in the political fabric of the country. The consequences of this rigidity became more apparent as pressure mounted. In other parts of the world, governments were rethinking economic strategies, experimenting with market mechanisms, and opening channels for public participation. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union remained bound to central planning methods that were losing relevance. Even modest proposals for modernization often encountered resistance from officials who feared that loosening control might weaken their position or disrupt the delicate balance of power. This reluctance prevented the system from evolving at a moment when flexibility was no longer a luxury but a necessity. Furthermore, the political structure made it difficult to recognize the growing divide between the leadership and the population. While citizens coped with shortages, delays, and limited opportunities, official rhetoric continued to emphasize success and unity. This disconnect widened as information from abroad became more accessible, revealing contrasts that made the Soviet narrative harder to sustain. Yet the leadership, accustomed to maintaining a consistent message, struggled to adapt its approach or acknowledge the need for deeper reform. The gap between experience and expectation became a quiet but powerful destabilizing force, weakening trust in institutions that had once held enormous authority. When discussions about reform finally began to circulate within the upper ranks, the system's limitations quickly became clear. Attempts to introduce controlled improvements often collided with entrenched interests. Bureaucratic complexity and political caution. Leaders who sought to modernize the system found that the very structure meant to maintain stability instead restricted their ability to guide meaningful change. This inability to evolve left the nation increasingly vulnerable to the pressures accumulating from every direction. Economic stagnation continued without relief, the arms race consumed vital resources, and public frustration simmered beneath the surface. By the early 1980s, it was evident that the Soviet Union was being held back not only by material challenges, but also by a political system unable to adjust to new realities. What had once been a source of unity became an obstacle to progress, and what had once ensured control now limited the capacity to adapt. This rigidity, deeply embedded in the country's institutions, shaped the course of the coming years, preparing the ground for the dramatic reforms that would soon emerge, reforms driven by the hope of renewal but destined to expose the system's deeper weaknesses. As economic stagnation deepened, military pressures intensified, and political structures proved unable to adjust. Another powerful force began reshaping the future of the Soviet Union from within. Across its vast territory, among the many republics that made up the Union, a quiet awakening was taking place. These regions, each with its own language, traditions, and historical memory, had long coexisted under a centralized system that promoted unity above all else. For decades, the promise of shared purpose and collective progress helped maintain cohesion, even when tensions surfaced. But as the system weakened and confidence in central leadership declined, older identities that had been subdued or reshaped by decades of policy began to re-emerge with new intensity, gradually undermining the authority that held the Union together. This shift did not happen suddenly. It grew in the spaces where local culture had always persisted, in communities where people still taught their children the stories of their ancestors, in regions where historical grievances were never fully forgotten. While the Soviet leadership emphasized a common path forward, many republics carried memories of earlier periods of autonomy, periods when their cultures had flourished independently. As living conditions became more difficult and political rigidity stifled meaningful debate, these memories gained strength. What had once been pride in local heritage evolved into questions about the balance of power between the republics and the center. People began to ask why decisions affecting their daily lives were made far away, by officials who often had little connection to their culture or circumstances. As dissatisfaction spread, cultural revival movements gained momentum. Writers, scholars, and community leaders began to speak more openly about language rights, local history, and the desire for greater control over regional affairs. These ideas spread quickly in an era when information was becoming harder to contain. For many citizens, embracing their national identity offered a sense of meaning during a time of economic uncertainty and political stagnation. For others, it became a way to express frustrations that could not be voiced through traditional political channels. What began as cultural expression soon developed into broader discussions about autonomy, accountability, and the future of the Union itself. The central government, already stretched thin, struggled to respond effectively. Attempts to suppress these movements risked provoking further unrest. Yet allowing them to grow openly challenged the authority that held the Soviet structure together. The leadership faced a dilemma. Acknowledging regional demands could encourage more assertive claims, but ignoring them only deepened the divide. As the political climate shifted and new reforms attempted to promote transparency, republics saw opportunities to articulate long-standing concerns. Local parliaments began asserting greater independence, passing laws that challenged central directives, Public demonstrations, once unthinkable, became increasingly common, signaling a profound change in the relationship between the republics and Moscow. These movements were not identical. Each region had its own history and aspirations. Yet together, they revealed a shared truth. The idea of a unified Soviet identity was weakening. In some areas, the push for cultural preservation evolved into calls for political independence. In others, economic dissatisfaction fueled demands for autonomy. Across the Union, the sense that the center could no longer effectively manage such a diverse and vast territory became increasingly difficult to deny. The unity that had once defined the Soviet project was now being tested by the very people it claimed to represent. By the mid to late 1980s, it was evident that these growing national movements were no longer just regional concerns, but fundamental challenges to the integrity of the state. They exposed how deeply the economic struggles, political rigidity, and prolonged external pressures had weakened central authority. As the republics asserted their identities and questioned their future within the Union, the structure that had held the Soviet system together for decades began to loosen, setting the stage for profound changes that would soon reshape the entire region. As pressures mounted from every direction, economic decline, military competition, political rigidity, and the rising voices of national identity, many within the Soviet leadership understood that the country could not continue on its current trajectory. When Mikhail Gorbachev rose to power in 1985, he inherited a system in need of profound change, yet bound by structures that resisted transformation. His response was to launch a series of reforms that he believed could revive the nation by opening space for honesty, innovation, and renewed public confidence. These reforms, known as glasnost and perestroika, were intended to strengthen the system by modernizing it. Instead, they exposed its vulnerabilities, accelerating the very unraveling they sought to prevent. Glasnost, or openness, encouraged public discussion of problems that had long been concealed behind official optimism. For decades, citizens had lived with shortages, inefficiencies, and unspoken frustrations, but these issues rarely appeared in newspapers or broadcasts. Now, media outlets were allowed to publish critical reports. Historians revisited neglected chapters of the past, and people openly expressed concerns that once remained private. What began as an effort to increase transparency soon revealed the scale of discontent that had been simmering beneath the surface. The more people learned about the difficulties facing the country, the more they questioned why these issues had been hidden for so long. This shift in public awareness weakened trust in institutions that relied on controlled information to maintain authority. At the same time, perestroika, or restructuring, attempted to modernize the economy by introducing limited elements of decentralization and market flexibility. Factories received more autonomy, cooperatives were allowed to operate, and local officials gained modest decision-making power. Yet the system was not prepared for such changes. Managers accustomed to following centralized directives struggled to adapt to new expectations. Consumers hoped for a rapid improvement in goods and services, but the reforms created disruptions that often made shortages worse. Prices fluctuated unpredictably, production became inconsistent, and the balance between state planning and emerging market practices remained unclear. Instead of solving the long-standing problems of stagnation, the reforms exposed the depth of the structural challenges that had accumulated over decades. These changes, though well-intentioned, also reshaped political dynamics across the republics. As glasnost expanded public debate, national movements gained momentum, using their newfound space to articulate ambitions that had previously been suppressed. Cultural revival transformed into political activism, and demands for autonomy grew louder. In some regions, newly elected local leaders challenged Moscow's authority with increasing confidence. framing their actions as necessary responses to decades of neglect. The central government, committed to openness but still reliant on old methods of control, found itself caught between competing forces that it could no longer contain. Meanwhile, the Communist Party, already weakened by years of rigidity, struggled with internal divisions. Reform-minded officials and traditionalists debated the future of the country, often with little agreement. As criticism became more open and widespread, the party lost its aura of unquestioned legitimacy. Members who once relied on the stability of the system to maintain their roles now faced an environment where authority was changing rapidly, and where long-standing assumptions about governance no longer held. For many citizens, the reforms created a paradoxical moment. They offered hope that the country was finally confronting its challenges. Yet they also brought uncertainty, confusion, and a sense that the old order was slipping away without a clear replacement. What had been introduced to strengthen the Soviet Union instead revealed how deeply strained it had become. Each attempt at renewal exposed another layer of fragility, and each step toward openness made it harder to maintain the unity that had defined the state for generations. By the late 1980s, it was clear that glasnost and perestroika had transformed the political landscape, encouraging voices that demanded more than the leadership could manage and accelerating a process of change that soon outpaced the government's ability to guide it. The reforms marked not only an attempt to save the system, but also the beginning of its irreversible transformation, setting the stage for events that would soon reshape the entire region. In the years after the Soviet Union began to fracture, the country moved through a long corridor of uncertainty. But nothing accelerated that unraveling more dramatically than the failed coup of 1991. What had started as a desperate attempt by hardline officials to preserve the old system ended up exposing how deeply that system had already hollowed out. The coup collapsed in just a few tense days, yet its consequences rippled far beyond the immediate political struggle. It left behind an authority structure that looked intact from the outside, but had been stripped of its strength, its legitimacy, and its ability to command the confidence of the people. From that moment, the Soviet government was no longer seen as a force capable of navigating the storm. It became a symbol of a dying era, fading even as it tried to present an image of control. In the streets, people who had once moved cautiously began speaking with a frankness that would have been unthinkable only a few years earlier. Each conversation, each small group forming near a metro station or inside a cramped apartment, carried the same quiet realization: the old order was slipping away, and no one knew what would replace it. The state's institutions, already weakened by economic strain and endless bureaucratic delays, now appeared directionless. Senior officials argued not about solutions but about survival, and even those who had remained loyal to the central government found themselves searching for signs of leadership that never came. As months passed, the absence of a clear path forward became impossible to ignore. The coup's failure had not only broken the illusion of unity, it had shattered the delicate balance that held the republics together. Leaders across the Soviet Union, from the Baltic coast to the Caucasus Mountains, watched the events of 1991 and understood that the center could no longer enforce its will. Local movements that had quietly gathered momentum now stepped into the open. Flags that had been folded away for decades were raised again, and speeches once whispered behind closed doors were delivered openly to cheering crowds. The atmosphere felt electric, charged with hope and uncertainty in equal measure. For many, it was the first time they could imagine shaping their own future, rather than following the path set by distant leaders in Moscow. Yet the transition was not smooth. The vacuum left behind by collapsing authority created confusion that touched every aspect of daily life. Offices that had once functioned with rigid procedures found themselves unsure who had the final say. Economic plans created under a centralized system no longer matched the rapidly changing reality on the ground. Families saw their savings shrink overnight. Store shelves already inconsistent became even more unpredictable, At the same time, newly emerging political groups rushed to define themselves, promising renewal while navigating the remnants of the old structure. The entire society felt as if it were suspended between two worlds, one fading, one not yet fully formed. Still, through all the uncertainty, there was a growing sense that change could no longer be postponed or reversed. The failed coup had revealed a truth that even the most cautious observers could no longer deny. The Soviet Union was no longer held together by conviction, only by habit, and the moment that habit was disrupted, everything else began to move. People who had lived their entire lives under the weight of a vast political system now witnessed its final chapters unfold in real time. They watched leaders deliver speeches attempting to restore confidence. But the words felt disconnected from the new reality. What remained of authority was a structure without a foundation, a building standing because no one had yet pushed it, not because it was strong enough to remain upright. As the year drew to a close, the implications of the failed coup became unmistakable. It had not merely weakened the last threads of authority, it had revealed that those threads had been fragile all along. In the months that followed, declarations of independence, negotiations, and shifting alliances moved at a pace few had expected. What had once seemed immutable transformed with breathtaking speed. The collapse was not a sudden fall, but a long descent that finally reached its end, leaving millions to step into an uncertain future shaped by decisions made in the shadow of that pivotal moment. In the end, the story of the Soviet Union's final years reveals a truth far more complex than the headlines that marked its fall. No single moment, no single speech, and no single confrontation caused the dissolution of a state that had once stretched across 11 time zones. Instead, it was the slow and steady erosion of pillars that had long appeared unshakable. The economy, strained by decades of inefficiency and mounting shortages, could no longer sustain the promises that had defined the system. The political structure, once centered around a powerful core, fractured under pressures from competing visions, rival factions, and leaders struggling to navigate a rapidly changing world. And within society, a quiet but profound shift had taken place. People had grown increasingly aware that the structures governing their lives were failing to respond to their needs, their hopes, and their sense of identity. By the time the failed 1991 coup exposed the depth of this internal decay, the unraveling had already been set in motion. Communities across the republics recognized that the center could no longer command authority, and the idea of unity once presented as destiny no longer aligned with daily reality. The collapse, then, was not the dramatic toppling of a single institution, but the convergence of many long-running struggles. Economic weakness deprived the system of stability. Political disputes dissolved any sense of coherence at the top. Social fragmentation widened the distance between leaders and the people they claimed to represent. Together, these forces created a turning point that no single reform or moment of resistance could reverse. Looking back, what stands out most is not just the scale of the change but the speed which it became irreversible once exposed. What had been concealed behind formal speeches, parade grounds, and carefully maintained images of strength suddenly appeared fragile. The republics, energized by new possibilities, moved decisively to shape their own futures. Ordinary citizens, once cautious and resigned, found themselves in a landscape where old rules no longer applied and new ones had not yet taken form. This mixture of uncertainty and aspiration defined the final chapter of the Soviet story, a chapter written by millions of individuals stepping into an unfamiliar horizon. As we reflect on this complex moment in history, it becomes clear that understanding the collapse requires looking beyond the dramatic headlines and recognizing the deeper forces at work. It was a story shaped by long-term pressures, human decisions, and shifting beliefs, and it serves as a reminder of how quickly entire systems can transform when their foundations begin to crack, even if the surface appears stable. Thank you for joining me on this journey through a pivotal moment that reshaped the modern world. If you enjoyed this story and want to explore more histories told with clarity and depth, please remember to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with others who might find it meaningful.